May is an interesting time to have events because you never know. It looks like everything's empty and then all of a sudden people gather together. So we're so happy to have you here today. Welcome to our lecture series, Museum Passport. Originally I was going to say new lecture series, but this is the 5th one. So if this is your first one, welcome. We do them every month, so we hope that you will join us. Check our website. They're usually on Tuesdays, but not always. It depends. My name is Allison Fatty. I'm the Assistant Curator of Public Programs here at the museum, and I have the really great pleasure today of introducing a friend from graduate school. Now, we're not going to tell you when that was. We got our master series together, and then she went on and got her PhD, so I'm going to introduce her as well. Her name is Dr. Magnatta. And she's going to be speaking today about Buddhist art. And I gave her a really big job. I didn't realize it at the time when I asked her to talk about this exhibition, because it is really expansive. It covers like the whole thing across all of Asia. So I told her she has 45 minutes to tell you the entire spectrum of Buddhist art. She will do a great job. She's going to touch on a lot of different things. There'll be time for Q&A at the end as well. The exhibition that this kind of stems from is called Realms of the Dharma, Buddhist Art Across Asia. It's currently on view at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and I know at least one person here has seen it because I talked to him about that at LACMA. So I took Sarah today to see the Tibetan prayer wheel at the Statue Botanical Garden, and I have to say I've never seen somebody take so many pictures from so many angles and of all the signage that was there. So I think that I don't know if that's my daughter here, but I think she enjoyed that time. And there was nobody there. So she was fascinated by the fact that we have such a beautiful space and you can really enjoy it. So in Denver, the Botanical Garden is pretty much you park on top of other people and then you fight to look at the lavender type of thing. So she loves it here. Not sure if you're ready to move, but maybe it's not coming. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. Sarah received her PhD in art history from Ohio State University and her MA in art history from the University of Denver, where we met. She specializes in global contemporary art, which is a huge, expansive thing I found out, and she has to be in charge of like all the grad students who do contemporary, because all grad students want to do contemporary of some kind. So she reads a lot of grad student papers, is what I found out yesterday. She teaches courses at the University of Denver on contemporary art through global perspectives. She previously worked at the Denver Art Museum, and she's curated several exhibitions. Her specialty is contemporary Tibetan art, which is an interesting specialty. So if you have questions for her afterwards too about that, she's happy to answer. One really great exhibition, which I started to look at the book and I was sharing the exhibition catalog, is Gomkar, I'm going to say it wrong, Gatsu. Intimacy and Immediacy, and that was at the Mirren Gallery in Denver. She also curated Tenzing Greenville's first solo U.S. exhibition, My World is in Your Blind Spot, at the Emmanuel Art Gallery in Denver and the Tibet House U.S. in New York City. A little bit about Realms of the Dharma. I'm going to let you do most of this. But it, at last, represents the International Survey of Buddhism and Buddhist Art, beginning with the religion's origins in India and following its spread through mainland and island Southeast Asia, Himalayas, and East Asia. So, like, it's the full expansive thing. In other words, it's a lot to talk about in 45 minutes. So, we will do a lot of grace in that. There will be time for Q&A at the end. Thank you so much for joining us. I know we're going to have a really insightful look into the world of Buddhist art, and I'll turn it over to Sarah again.
Thanks so much for being here. Everyone can hear me okay? Good. Thank you to Allison Foudy for inviting me to speak to you today. My museum passport talk will look at Buddhist art from a wide range of time and space, from the beginning of the religious tradition thousands of years ago up to present day imagery. And as Allison mentioned, I'm going to be looking at some of the works recently on display at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, or LACMA as it's commonly known, in their Realms of the Dharma exhibition, curated by Stephen Little and Tishara Bindu. The works in this exhibition were from LACMA's permanent collection, some of which I'll show you today. I will also show works from other collections around the world and some works that are still in situ or on site. For example, some rock-cut Buddhas in Afghanistan and works still in temples in various parts of Asia. I will also be looking at images from the collection at the Denver Art Museum, where I served as the interpretive specialist for the Asian art department for several years. And for those of you who aren't sure what an interpretive specialist does, they're the ones that create the links between the artworks and the audiences. So for example, they might write the labels used in the exhibitions, or find videos to accompany the artworks, or diagrams or maps, etc. So it was a really fun job, and I had the great pleasure of working closely with that collection. So you'll see some works from Denver as well. But before I get started today, I want to point out that there are many, many forms of Buddhist practice, even within a single sect of Buddhism. So it might be more appropriate to think of these artworks as part of the visual culture of Buddhisms with an S, and also to keep in mind that we will just be able to see a few things today. So I use these two images to elucidate just how different Buddhist practices can look. On the left is a Zen Buddhist image of the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, depicted through calligraphy. And on the right, an elaborate image of the same figure of Shakyamuni Buddha in a Tibetan Buddhist tanka. So these are very different visual interpretations of essentially the same thing. But let's get started back at the beginning here. The look at the historical figure who started things off, and this is the historical Buddha. So you'll note I'm referring to him as the historical Buddha because we will encounter many, many other Buddhas in the various Buddhisms you will see. But when you see the term Shakyamuni Buddha, you know you're looking at an image of the historical Buddha. That's the man who lived in the 6th to 5th century BCE. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, and he was a prince in the Shakya clan, so his later name references him as the sage of the Shakyas. We don't actually find images of the Buddha for several hundreds of years after his death, and I will talk about why in a little bit, but I want to start with his life story as it is illustrated in some of the earliest imagery we have from the Gandhara region of South Asia. I'll show you a few images here as I talk about the life story of the Buddha, then I will return to these to talk more about the imagery itself. So when I say we're looking at the Gandhara region, I mean this area north of where modern-day India lies, in parts of Pakistan and Afghanistan. And this map shows you the Kushan Empire, which is about the 1st to 3rd century CE. And this is when we see the rise of Buddha imagery throughout the empire. So Siddhartha Gautama was born in a royal family on the border of Nepal and Tibet, and he was born to a woman named Queen Maya. Maya had been visited by an elephant in one of her dreams, who gave her the news about her upcoming motherhood. And sure enough, 9 months later, she gave birth to the child who would become the Buddha. It is said that to do so, once she went into labor, she reached up to grab a tree branch to steady herself, and the Buddha baby popped out of her side, as you can see here. He could immediately stand and walk. His mother unfortunately died a week after giving birth, so his father became very protective. And a sage told his father, who was the king, that the baby would either grow up to be a great political ruler or a great religious leader. Now the king, wanting to keep his lineage and rule going, wanted to make sure that Siddhartha followed in his footsteps. So he kept the prince in a bubble of sorts within the palace walls and gave him everything he could possibly want. But when Siddhartha turned 29, he became restless and left the palace. He came across what would become known as the four sights. He saw an old man, and he realized that even as a prince, he himself would become old. He saw a sick man, and again, he realized that his wealth could not protect him from becoming sick. A dead man, so he realized death would come for all, again, regardless of status. And an ascetic practitioner. So this would have been a Hindu ascetic who had given up all material goods to focus on spiritual matters. After a brief return to the palace, he decided to leave for good and join those ascetic practitioners. So for years, Siddhartha tried this extreme approach. He gave up most food, it said he only accepted a grain of rice per day. He gave up shelter, he gave up warm clothing. And at the end of several years of this approach, he realized that neither extreme was really useful. His luxurious days at the palace would not prevent his suffering, but nor would giving up all comforts. So he went to sit under a tree and meditated for 49 days. And as he sat under the tree, it is said he was attacked by the demons of Mara, with various hallucinations reminding him of his luxurious life at the palace. and he could return at any time. On the 49th day, having fought those demons, Siddhartha reached his hand to the ground, as you see here, and he called the earth to witness his enlightenment. And he was awakened at that moment, becoming the Buddha. From curator Stephen Little's introductory text for the Realms of the Dharma exhibition and catalog, he says, at the moment of his enlightenment, the Buddha experienced the realization of the illusory nature of existence, the fundamental impermanence and transience of all things, the character of cause and effect, and the notion that nothing originates independently of other things. That's the concept of interdependent origination. So the Buddha, as he was now known, meaning the awakened one, began to travel around South Asia with his disciples, and his teachings would ultimately become known as the Dharma. In this image, his hand gesture, or mudra, references the turning of the wheel, or the Dharma chakra, which is the first sermon that he taught at Sarnath. And during that sermon, he talked about the Four Noble Truths. He said, all life is suffering. Suffering is caused by egoistic desire, attachment, and cravings. The way to cease suffering is to cease desire, attachment, and cravings. And the way to cease desire, attachment, and cravings, that is to achieve that detachment, is to follow the Eightfold Path that he developed. And that Eightfold Path he came up with includes right views, right intentions, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Now, I showed you a few scenes from Buddha's life to illustrate his story, but there are actually more complete scenes of his life in various depictions. They're just a little bit hard to see on PowerPoint. But, for example, these are two paintings with scenes from the life of the Buddha from the Denver Art Museum. They are very different in style. The one on the left from Thailand has a more naturalistic setting. There are various parts of Buddha's life depicted throughout. And the Tibetan painting on the right has many of the same scenes depicted, but in a more regimented way, and they're placed directly around a large central image of the Buddha after enlightenment. So when I was a part of the team for the exhibition titled Linking Asia at the Denver Museum, we decided to put these paintings next to each other and draw out some of the similar moments so audiences could see how artists from very different places might approach the same topic. And this is the larger extended label we use to do so. So I know this is also hard to see from where you are, but the images on the right are details of the same moments from the life of the Buddha from each of the two depictions. So for example, the middle one shows Siddhartha cutting his hair before he joined the ascetics. After the life of the Buddha, we do not have any figural imagery of the Buddha. There have been theories as to why that might be. First, perhaps images of the Buddha were just made out of ephemeral materials, wood and painting, etc. So they simply would not have lasted this long. Another more prominent theory became known as the aniconic theory, and this posited that other types of imagery, such as the tree shown here, for example, were stand-ins for the Buddha, and that there may have been a ban on imagery of the Buddha. The problem with this theory, as pointed out by scholar Susan Huntington, is that it's a very Western-centric approach, meaning just because Western religious traditions have bans on depicting gods does not mean that Buddhism did. And in fact, we find no ban in any textual sources. There's not a line saying thou shalt not create graven images, for example. And what's more, the Buddha never claimed to be divine. He only claimed that all people could be awakened or enlightened. So what are we looking at here? Proponents of the aniconic theory would say we're looking at an early image of the Buddha. Huntington and those that follow her argument would say that we're looking at the veneration of the Bodhi tree, the tree of enlightenment, which is certainly something you would see in India. You see veneration at the Bodhi tree. And this debate continues. But by the Kushan Empire at the 1st century CE, we do see Buddha figural imagery arising in two places, Gandhara and Mathura. So this is a work from Gandhara. Now, you may notice something about this work and the ones I showed earlier. Perhaps you were looking at the clothing and thinking, wow, this looks really Greek or Roman. And you're correct to note that influence. Because if we briefly turn back to our map, we could see that Gandhara is an area that Alexander the Great came through hundreds of years prior, leaving many groups of Greek communities, and thus Greek influence and later the influence of the Romans. And sure enough, this image of the Buddha looks like he could be Apollo. He has the drapery inspired by the classical world. He has a very naturalistic appearance, which was the goal of these particular artists. And here he sits on a lotus base, and he's flanked by figures known as bodhisattvas, which I will discuss a bit later. He also sits under the tree of enlightenment. LACMA has several Gandharan images in its collection, and here you see a standing Buddha figure, again with the drapery of classical influence. You'll note he's also made of gray schist, which is common for the Gandharan area. He has one hand raised in this gesture of apaya, or fear not. And again, these hand gestures symbolize various messages are known as mudra. So that may have developed out of the practice of approaching someone with your hands up to show you were not holding any weapons. And here's a close-up of that same figure. You can see the artist is attempting a very naturalistic portrayal of his face and hair. Now, the scene I started with today, the birth of the Buddha, as you see here, is from the same area. So you may have noted the similarity to this type of work in a frieze from a Greek temple, for example. Here we have scenes from the life of the Buddha. So we have an interest in the biography of the man that really takes hold in this Gandhara region. And so if we go here from right to left, as though we're circumambulating the space, we have the birth again. We've got the enlightenment, that moment when the Buddha reaches his hand down for the earth to witness his enlightenment. The first teaching, so turning the wheel of the Dharma, the teachings. And then the parinirvana, or nirvana when the Buddha would die and then cease to be reborn, which was ultimately a good thing. But further south, at the same time, we have artists developing a different type of figure Buddha image, one that more closely aligns with some of the textual sources about the Buddha and his superhuman qualities rather than naturalistic qualities. So to give you a map with modern boundaries, just to orient yourself, here we have the region of Mathura. It's the southern part of the Kushan Empire, with the northern part of modern India. And here is a Buddha created in the Mathuran region from the same time period, with a very different approach. These artists were more interested in the symbolic attributes of the Buddha. For example, his prana, or the life breath that is shown here in his belly. You can see it. You can see his belly rather than heavy drapery. In fact, the drapery is very light. You just see slight evidence of it, the lines on the arm and across the body. When the Buddha was awakened, it said that his cranium expanded. So we get something called an ushnisha. This is not a bun of hair on the top of his head, but an expansion. And here the artist created a swirl that's very different from the Gandharan Buddha, which looked like a bun of hair. The urna is a mark or a tuft of hair on the Buddha's forehead. And by the way, there are 32 marks of the Buddha mentioned in textual sources. They also include things like golden skin, webbed fingers and toes, in addition to more poetic descriptions like having the lips of a mango and the eyebrows of an archer's bow. So these artists created an image of the Buddha that highlighted the superhuman qualities of the figure rather than the biography of the man, as they did further north. And here you can see details of things like the ushnisha, that protuberance, and then the urna, which is that tuft of hair on his forehead. After the Kushan Empire, we see here in yellow the rise of the Gupta Empire. So by the time of the Gupta period, or the so-called Golden Age in India, we have images like this, which really beautifully combine elements of the naturalism from Gandhara with the symbolic elements of attributes of Mathura. So for example, here we have snail shell curls on his head. There's both a logistical story for these, and that is that the Buddha had to cut his hair when he became an ascetic. So as it grew back, it was curly. And there's also a poetic explanation, in that as he meditated under that tree for 49 days, to prevent his scalp from burning, a row of snails climbed up his back and circled his head to protect him. Which I like that one. This is the type of Buddha you might see nowadays at a world market or something. So, from home decor. So we tend to see this style, and that's an entirely different discussion. But we can see just how widespread this Gupta influence has been. And here is a detail of those snail shell curls, those really beautiful carving. I don't know if many of you have tried carving in stone, but to get something that looks like light drapery and fabric would be incredibly difficult. And you see here on the arms, too, that the stone is carved to look like light fabric. And the hands here. Here's another Gupta figure from LACMA, unfortunately missing his head, but you can still note the sheer quality of the drapery on his body. We still see that prana, or the life breath of the Buddha. So it's almost as if the drapery is not just wet drapery, which sometimes we hear that term when discussing Greek or Roman art, but the body is glowing through the drapery. It's clearly not the drapery here that's important. And during this period, this style moves throughout Asia, particularly back up into the Gandharan region, where we see the Gupta period development of these massive Buddha figures. So here we are in Bamiyan. Bamiyan's in modern day Afghanistan, but during the Gupta dynasty, this is a place where travelers and traders would have come across two massive golden Buddhas amongst a honeycombed mountainside full of paintings and Buddhist texts in all of these caves that you can hopefully see to the right and in between some of these Buddha figures. And we know these would have been spectacular to see in their original form. One Chinese traveler in the 7th century wrote about these, saying, "To the northeast of the royal city, there's a mountain on which is placed a stone figure of the Buddha at height 140 or 150 feet. Its golden blue sparkle on every side, and its precious ornaments dazzle the eyes with their brightness." So it would have been quite a sight as a traveler to come through and to see these figures. And just for a sense of scale, you could see the small doorway at the bottom right, which would be human size. These were really quite large. Sadly, these Buddhas were both destroyed in 2001 by the Taliban. Not only has that been really devastating for all of humanity, but it's been particularly devastating for the local communities in the area who benefited from the tourism there. And the economy was certainly impacted for those people. Now, a few years back, there were some attempts at rectifying the situation. And we see here this great digital projection into the niches. You can't really rebuild something that's rock cut. It's not ever going to be the same. But this was an interesting moment for contemporary art history. And here's another view of that projection. And then just a couple of weeks ago, this contemporary work emerged by Tuan Andrew Lin, and you can now go see a 27-foot tall version of one of the Buddhas on the High Line in Manhattan. So the two figures, the larger Buddha had been affectionately referred to as Salsal by the local community in Boston, which translates to the light that shines through the universe, which is also the title of Lin's work. The artist sourced artillery brass from Afghanistan through a friend's network across the Bamiyan region and brought it over the Pakistani border. There he recast it into the shapes of mudras, again those symbolic hand gestures used extensively in Buddhist and Hindu iconography. But those hands, of course, have been missing for some time, even before the destruction of the Buddhas. So it's a very interesting additional component by the contemporary artist. And here's a close-up of those hands. And then I love this one. So back to India and the development of Buddhist art. The final phase of Buddhist art in India occurred between the 8th and 12th centuries. And we again had a period of an enormous amount of resources being poured into Buddhist art. So this was a period of the rise of the two large university-style spaces of learning. Here are the ruins of one that was called Nalanda, so you can see just how massive this would have been. And as for style, certain elements start to take hold, including this upside-down horseshoe-shaped halo that you can see on both of these figures, this crossbar thrown back, a very stylized double lotus base that the figures sit on. And if we look at these two sculptures from the Denver Art Museum, we see a Buddha and a bodhisattva with very similar features. Now, a bodhisattva on the right here is an enlightened being. It is very similar to a Buddha, but bodhisattvas are considered to be beings who are enlightened but are delaying ultimate nirvana until all sentient beings are saved. This figure in particular is Avalokiteshvara, and he is the bodhisattva of compassion. So we will see him later in East Asia, where he's known as Guanyin in China and Kannon in Japan. And often we see bodhisattvas in South Asia with jewelry and princely garb. This is something we don't see with imagery of Shakyamuni, since he gave up those things after leaving the palace. And here's the one at LACMA. You can see the halo is round here, it's not horseshoe shaped, but we do have these mythical figures on the side that become prominent during this period. We've got that crossbar thrown back. The Bhumishvarsa Mudra, which is that calling the earth to witness his enlightenment, becomes very popular during this time. And many Apala period Buddhas and Bodhisattvas also include what's known as the Dharma, a mantra of sorts that is inscribed above the heads within the halos. The Dharma is about the interdependence of all things, stated here as, of those phenomena which arise from causes, those causes have been taught by the Buddha and their cessation too, thus proclaims the great ascetic. Now, Maitreya is another bodhisattva, but he's also the Buddha of the future. And he has an ascetic's piled hair style with a miniature stupa, or a funerary monument, in his headdress that identifies him as Maitreya. He wears lots of jewelry, including the Brahmanical sacred thread over his left shoulder. He's seated on a lotus base in a posture of royal ease, and his right hand, which is now missing, was likely held in the gesture of discourse, or Vitarka Mudra. Curator Stephen Little notes that a companion image of Avalokiteshvara is now in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. So together, they originally would have flanked a larger Buddha image. So we've been looking at several stone images, but here's a copper alloy version of an Avalokiteshvara, because in addition to these stone versions, there's lots of casting work being done during the Pala period. And he has some similar components, but these are the works that would have been easily transported throughout Asia. The stone ones would not. These would be easily moved throughout Asia, so we see another expansion of Buddhist imagery during the Pala period that spreads to other regions. I also want to note the imagery we have of female Buddhas from this period. In some, not all, Buddhist sects, women are just as capable as men of enlightenment. And here we have, shocking, I know, here we have the Buddha Tara, or the Buddhist goddess Tara, as she's sometimes known, and she sits in the pose of ease, or Lalitasana, with her right leg pendant and supported by a lotus flower. She wears lots of jewelry and elegant textiles, and her hand is held in the gesture of charity, or Varada Mudra. She also has the Sanskrit inscription of the Dharma above her head, which you can see here. Now, during the Pala period, we see the expansion of imagery that's related to Tantric Buddhism. I noted at the beginning of this lecture just how many Buddhisms there are, and this is one type where we have a very esoteric practice that includes wrathful deity imagery and sexual union imagery. And this is the imagery and type of practice that moves into Nepal and Tibet, where we will ultimately call it Tibetan Buddhism or Vajrayana Buddhism. So here you see the wrathful deity Shakrasamvara with his many heads and arms. He holds many weapons, a flaying knife, a skull cup. And these wrathful deity figures are for the benefit of the practitioner. They are not demonic or devil-like in any way. So instead, think of this metaphor. Perhaps a mother sees her young child run into the street, and this child is about to be hit by the oncoming traffic. The mother will run into the street and aggressively shove that child out of the way. That child is probably terrified for being pushed so hard so quickly, but the mother has saved the child's life. Likewise, the wrathful deities are there to shock you out of your ego, to shock you out of your belief that you exist separately from everything else. So these were certainly images that were misunderstood by Western scholars who first got to the Himalayan region and thought tantric art was about sex and violence. It is not. A side note, one of the components held by Shakrasamvara is a Vajra, and in fact, this type of Buddhism is often called Vajrayana Buddhism. It doesn't have a great English translation. Some have translated Vajra to thunderbolt, and some have preferred to call it the diamond vehicle, since diamonds are unbreakable. But it's really that notion of something unbreakable and unshakable that's at the root of the Vajra. And again, it will be Vajrayana Buddhism that takes hold in Tibet. I just want to show you the back of this image quickly. So you can see we do have the head and the back fully depicted here. Shakrasamvara is in this militant posture, and his right foot is atypically placed in the lap of the Hindu goddess Kalavatri. So, the Pala period in particular created several metal works and palm leaf manuscripts that traveled through Nepal into Tibet. So we'll start with Nepal, and here's a work from LACMA where you see the same figure of Shakrasamvara, and here he's in sexual union with his consort Vajravarahi. But this union is really a metaphor for the unification of wisdom and compassion. The female is wisdom, the male is compassion. Always. I know, I always hear that. It's true. And a practitioner must have both occur in alignment. This is not a literal directive, but again, it's a metaphor for the practice of wisdom and compassion coming together. And curator Stephen Little beautifully describes this image. This exquisite sculpture of the Shakrasamvara and Vajravarahi perfectly captures the bliss of the enlightened mind. Shakrasamvara is shown with his usual iconography of 12 arms, indicating the 12-fold chain of causation in the phenomenal world. Vajravarahi blissfully looks up into Shakrasamvara's face, offering him a skull cup filled with purified ambrosia with her left hand, and holding a flaying knife, symbolizing the severing of conceptual thought with her right. And then in Tibet, we find those same figures in sexual union, we find wrathful deity figures, and we also find these figures known as dakini. Dakini is the Sanskrit word. The Tibetan word is kadroma. And I really like the Tibetan word for her because the Tibetan word means skywalker. And I always wonder if that's where George Lucas got this idea for a skywalker, because that is the literal Tibetan translation. She has, again, she's very helpful for practitioners. She has a flaying knife and a skull cup. She would have been trampling on a personification of ignorance. She has a garland of decapitated heads. All of these things, again, to help the practitioner. And here's another from Mongolia, where we have Tibetan Buddhism as well. And similar features, again, these are beneficial features. Now, that same sexual union we just looked at is often found at the center of painted mandalas. A mandala is a 2- or 3-dimensional representation of the universe in Buddhist thought. These can be very complicated. And I'd like to again read curator Stephen Little's commentary on this work. Quote, in this complex painting created as an aid to meditation, 16 different mandalas dedicated to the deity Vajra, the personification of the Vajra Tantra, surround a central mandala. In the center, Vajra dances in ecstasy while embracing his consort, who symbolizes wisdom. Vajra is depicted as a cosmic god with 8 heads and 16 arms, each of which holds a skull cup containing an animal or deity. The 4 enemies of enlightenment who Vajra tramples beneath his feet are the Hindu gods Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, and Indra. On the 8 petals of the central lotus are dancing figures of the goddesses who emerge from the union of the principal pair. Outside of the ring, female deities are the 4 gates to the palace. The mandalas are conceived of as a palace symbolizing knowledge. The outer circle of the central mandala depicts the 8 cemeteries or cremation grounds. And so, as you can already imagine, that these get incredibly complicated. In Tibetan Buddhist practice, meditation does not require emptying one's mind or clearing one's thoughts. It's a journey through these mandala spaces in a similar manner to what's depicted in the imagery. And here's a detail of that central image. Now, the vast majority of the LACMA show and catalog consists of works from South Asia, which is modern-day India and Pakistan area, and from the Himalayas, including Tibet. But they did also include a few from Southeast Asia and East Asia, so I want to turn to a few of those. And here's a contemporary map of the regions of Southeast Asia. Of course, since we just looked at a mandala, I just wanted to show this large-scale, 3-dimensional mandala, which we won't look at closely today, but just so you have a sense of what a mandala might look like, both in a painted form in Tibet and what it might look like in architectural form in Indonesia here. And this is a stupa, so it is solid. And this is also a representation of the universe in Buddhist thought. But I'll move to Cambodia, where we have another stunning Buddhist monument, the Bayon Temple at Angkor Thom. Most of you are likely familiar with Angkor Wat, which was built as a Hindu temple by the Khmer Empire. But you might not realize that there were also Buddhist rulers during the Khmer Empire. One of those was Jayavarman, whose face is likely the one depicted here, though he saw himself as an incarnate or representative of Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion. So these faces are a composite of sorts, and here's a detail of that face. But to return to the museum world, this is the style we often see when looking at Khmer sculpture. These very simple garments on figures with nude upper bodies, broad faces with these enigmatic smiles, very much like the Bayon Temple we just looked at. This is the embodiment of wisdom, the Buddha Prajnaparamita. So she has a small Buddha figure in her crown, and she is seen as the necessary counterpart to Avalokiteshvara, again the bodhisattva of compassion. At LACMA, there's a head of either Prajnaparamita or Avalokiteshvara. It's difficult to tell because the body is missing, and the face could be that of either figure. And the Buddha figure points to both, that Buddha figure in the headdress. So it's unclear who this is. But this is common that we find heads separated from their bodies. There have been massive repatriation campaigns to try to reunite heads with bodies still in Cambodia. In many cases, these were looted after the U.S. war in Southeast Asia and the destabilization that followed, including the rule of the Khmer Rouge. So it is beyond the scope of this presentation to dive into repatriation. But of course, when you see the heads of Buddhas in any institution, you know right away these heads are not created that way. They have been taken off of the bodies. Over to Thailand. This sculpture is described as one of the masterpieces in LACMA's Southeast Asian art collection. It's in the style of a type of Buddha image that developed in Thailand in the 14th century and is associated with the site and kingdom of Sukhothai in present-day North Central Thailand. And this is really the beginning of the modern Thai nation and a golden period of tremendous cultural achievements. So we still have several of the standard iconographic features, including the snail shell curl hair and the cranial protuberance, the elongated earlobe symbolizing his renunciation of the material world when he gave up those big earrings that he wore as a prince. But a large flame here forms a finial on the top of the head, and this may be the most recognizable aspect of Buddhists from Thailand and other parts of Southeast Asia. Another aspect of these Sukhothai figures is this boneless quality of the body. He almost appears to have no muscles or skeleton. And so we continue to see some of the components of iconography remain the same, and other aspects of style change quite dramatically. Now, Buddhism moves to East Asia probably by the 1st century CE, though we have few works in existence at that time. One of the earliest works we have is actually from the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. This is the earliest known dated Buddha figure from China. So there are earlier images of the Buddha, but this one actually has a date on it. And I think you can see right away that there are some influences coming from the Gandhara region, particularly with the drapery, though it is far more stylized here. We have these U shapes down the body and an interesting mudra that may have been a misrepresentation of the meditation mudra, or perhaps different symbolism that remains unknown. He may have been attached to a halo, which is what this metal piece here might have been for, and he may have been consecrated with imagery or mantras included in the hollow base, though those are missing now. We also have the rise of a type of Buddhist practice in China known as Pure Land Buddhism. And here's an image of an immersive scene in Dunhuang in China, where caves hold paintings and sculptures and texts. And Pure Land Buddhism is a type of Buddhism where there is an afterlife of sorts. And it makes sense in East Asia, since Buddhism was merging with cultures that already believed in ancestor veneration and in an ancestral realm. So we see the develop of, for example, Western paradise scenes and beliefs about being reborn in the Western paradise with Amitabha Buddha or with Maitreya. And we still have some of our same figures appearing throughout China, including our friend, the Bodhisattva of Compassion, who is known as Guanyin in China. And again, with the assimilation with other figures already popular in Chinese traditions, sometimes Guanyin is depicted as a female figure or as a motherly type figure, but other times we get figures more like this one, a stunning wooden sculpture that would have been painted, by the way, with vivid colors. And this figure would have accompanied several other figures as part of a larger immersive scene. Another one from the LACMA collection, you can see just how different these figures look. This is also Guanyin, and it's a brass version from the Ming Dynasty. So much later than the other one, but still, he has his recognizable small Buddha in his headdress, so we know it is Guanyin. Now, the Chinese versions of Buddhism move through Korea and Japan, so we largely see those influences in the works. To start, here's one of the oldest wooden structures in the world, the Horyuchi in Nara, and we have scenes of Pure Land paradises within, though some areas of the structure have burned and are not original, but much is. We find Amitabha, again, actually just for example, here's Amitabha in Paradise, it is Paradise Realm. And like so many other Buddhas we've seen so far, he is flanked by bodhisattva figures. So some things do remain remarkably consistent. We find Amida or Amitabha again in the Phoenix Hall. So again, these notions of a paradise realm are found in these highly immersive spaces. And this particular Amida Buddha was created with a new technique developed by the artist Jocho, who thought, when we carve these things out of big tree trunks, they're very heavy, the wood splits, they don't last very long. So he developed the technique where they would hollow out separate pieces of wood, join them together. So it's this joined wood technique. The images were much lighter, and then they would gild the images, so they have this golden covered, this beautiful golden look to them. Now, Amida does not just appear in sculpture form, but we often find him in these paintings known as Raigo, or welcoming images, where Amida is descending from heaven to help the practitioner on his or her way to the Pure Land. These paintings sometimes included actual cords being held by the Buddha for use for those on their deathbeds to hold on to and be pulled by Amida into the Pure Land. And one more type of Buddhism takes hold in East Asia. That is Zen Buddhism, as it is known in Japan, though it actually started with the figure Bodhidharma from India and is also popular as Chan Buddhism in China. And Bodhidharma, by the way, becomes known as Dharma in Japan. And with Zen Buddhist practice, there is a belief that enlightenment is possible through menial tasks. So you may be chopping wood or cutting carrots for dinner, and bam, that's when enlightenment occurs. Of course, that's only after many years of meditation and practice with a Zen master, but we do see the immediacy of the philosophy appear in visual form. There are just a few brushstrokes here to paint the portrait of Dharma. So only a few strokes are needed, of course, with the artist too. There would have been years and years of practice to be able to use a brush with ink on paper or silk, which you cannot correct, to get the lines you want. And here's another painting of Dharma. And here's an image of Dharma when he was meditating facing the wall of a cave for many years. It is said that Eka, this figure who wanted to be a student of Dharma, was told no by the master several times, so he cut off his arm to show his dedication and showed that to Dharma, who could then take him on as a student. Cave wall while meditating. Again, it's a simple brushstroke that holds so much information within. And also just the calligraphy itself, just the words Shakyamuni Buddha can become the Buddha and take the place of the image. So we've talked about the various uses of the Buddha image to promote Buddhist thought in South Asia, and Vajrayana Buddhism in Tibet, and Pure Land Buddhism in China, and Zen Buddhism in Japan. And I want to conclude today by looking at a few of the images of the Buddha from an artist that I work with. So I'm actually a contemporary art historian, and I've worked with several artists from the Tibetan diaspora, one of whom, Okur Gyatso, has created images using the Buddha form since the 1980s. Gyatso was born in Lhasa in Tibet, but went to Beijing in the early 1980s to study painting. He does have family ties to the government, and so he's more freely able to move around. He moved to the Tibetan exile community of Dharamsala in India in the early 1990s, where he first faced quite a few difficulties regarding his works and his identity. And ironically, that backlash was from the Orthodox Tibetan community. For those practitioners, altering the form of the Buddha is heresy. The image of the Buddha is the Buddha, so this is just not an acceptable practice. And here you see a work that was at the Met for some time in New York City with a split down the middle of it. That would be a big no-no for Buddhist practitioners. And you can see here some references to political statements, such as where can I find the American dream and the Arab Spring. There's commentary on world events, but also the effect of mass-produced pop culture through the artist's use of stickers and cartoon characters, consumer goods, and political figures. The collage here may be read in so many ways, perhaps commercialism more broadly, or the commodification of Buddhism. There are really endless ways of interpreting this deconstructed Buddha. At our recent exhibition at the University of Denver, we were so fortunate to have several of Gyatso's works, and we titled the exhibition Gokar Gyatso, Intimacy and Immediacy. This is from the advertisement for that show, and you'll notice that Gokar is still playing with imagery of the Buddha after many decades. The impetus for the exhibition was actually a collection of drawings that Gyatso did each day during the pandemic. And those drawings are here. So you can see we actually displayed them as one work of art with an introductory panel text for no separate labels. And then we had 3 Buddha sculptures like this one in the 3 gallery spaces. So even though the show was ostensibly about the drawings, we had this tie to his previous Buddha imagery with the COVID-related Buddhas. And they actually let me paint the gallery walls this red color, which was shocking, but I think it worked out really well. But to return to a painting Gyatso did back in 1989, when he still lived in Lhasa, he said, an artist should be free to use the form of the Buddha like a canvas. Just because it's in the shape of the Buddha does not make it the Buddha. And so we go from an image of a tree that might be a Buddha to an image of the Buddha that is not. The history of Buddhist art and visual culture is one that spans thousands of years and miles, and the LACMA show, the collection at Dan, and this presentation have just provided a sliver of the materials produced. Thank you so much.
Wow.
We have time for questions, so that would be great.
How did you become interested in Buddhist, especially contemporary art?
Well, I first became interested in Buddhist art as an undergraduate, where I happened to take a class on Tibetan art history, which is not common. This is at CU Boulder. And so I sort of dove into this realm of Buddhist art and older Tibetan art, and in fact, that's what I went to grad school for. The contemporary side didn't happen until I started working at the Denver Art Museum, which actually was only 12 years ago, maybe. And I started working with artists coming into the museum, and I thought, wow, I can talk to the artists who made the work, and I can actually hear the stories about the work, and that's a lot better than 15th century. So I started working with Tibetan artists at that point, and ended up back at University of Denver in the contemporary art position there. Yeah.
You're an artist, and I dare not try and pronounce his name, Gyatso, or
Gokar Gyatso.
so. Really reminded me of the temple, the contemporary that I visited in Northern Thailand.
Okay.
Have you been there?
I have not.
It has the same kind of art with the flying jets and the
Okay.
exploding, towers from 9/11,
yeah,
and
right.
the Beatles and
The pop
and then
culture. Yeah, that's
So I
interesting.
was just wondering if you.
Yeah, he's been doing that since the 80s. So he is the first Tibetan artist to be showcased at the Venice Biennale. Of course, it wasn't in the Tibet Pavilion because that doesn't exist, but it was at the central show. And so he's been really challenging, not just what Buddhist art can be, because clearly an Orthodox Buddhist community is not thrilled with that, but he's also challenging ideas of pop culture and commercialization. Yeah.
Could you just explain a little more about the hands that were attached?
the figure at the Highline?
Yes, and actually, I wish I had a better image. I won't go all the way back because I think it's farther back. Those images are not actually attached to the figure. He's got them on poles right in front. And so they look as though they're attached, but they're really not. So it's an incredible work. And I think the idea that he's used artillery for those hand gestures, those symbolic hand gestures that have meaning, is really quite interesting. Yeah, I wish I had an image of it. But you can find it easily. This just went up a couple of weeks ago. So you should be able to find that one. Yeah.
About 20 years ago, I went to a talk by a geologist who was involved in trying to rebuild the giant Buddha in Afghanistan. And they were using the magnetic orientation of metals and rocks to try to piece them back together again, piece by piece. And do you have any information about that or where that's gone?
I don't. I think that would be a challenge for sure. Also, with rock cut imagery, nothing's ever built from stone from the ground up if it's rock cut. When we use that phrase rock cut architecture, it means it's top down. So you're carving things out from the top down. You think of Petra, you think of Egypt. There are several places that do rock cut architecture. It would be an enormous amount of time and energy and resources to do that. To build from the bottom up is a lot easier, but it's never going to have that same effect, right? It's never going to be emerging from the ground. So I don't know what project that is, and maybe that's in the works. But it certainly was a big loss for everyone, and the people in that region especially. Yeah.
Well, thank you for a great talk. I was born in a small town, 2 hours from a small town called Texel, which is in the Magnatta region. And there's a museum for the Magnatta region, which has one of the largest collection of Buddhist sculptures. We used to go there growing up as school trips. And I was there 3 years ago, and I took a guided tour from the local museum curator. And one of the things that he said was one of the few places you will find standing Buddha sculptures. And I think in your presentation, the one you showed was the standing Buddha sculpture was from Pakistan, right? Is that correct?
We have some from India and some from Pakistan, yes. So,
but that's a rare thing, isn't it?
I'm not sure how many exist. I know that we don't really have walking Buddha images except in Thailand, for example. Standing, I think, is more common than in South Asia, but I don't have a number of how many there might be. But yeah, it's interesting, and there's theories as to why that is. Again, maybe things are made out of ephemeral materials, and they were there and we don't have them. There's a theory that in Thailand, there was a king who used to go out amongst the people, and he was very friendly. And so we start to see Buddhas that are walking, which we don't really have in South Asia, which is odd when you consider how much he walked with his disciples to teach around India. But I don't know, just how many there would have been. Yeah, it's a good question. Other questions?
We have time for one more.
Okay.
Can you tell us about the portly Buddha?
Oh, Buddha, yeah. Yes, so, yes. And I used to start my classes when I teach Buddhist art with a Buddha figure. These are Chinese Buddhas often that are conflations of Buddha figures, with folk figures, folk deity figures. And so they've become assimilated into the Buddhist canon in East Asia. We don't tend to see those figures in South Asia. And certainly the historical Buddha doesn't ever have a big ego or anything. He has prana, which is that life breath, but that's a different thing than those Buddhas of wealth and abundance that we see in China.
Go ahead, one
Okay,
more.
oh, sorry. You mentioned that Guanyin, and you refer it to he, but in China or in Hong Kong, like the Guanyin I've seen, they're like female figures with really delicate features.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we sometimes see the female Guanyin, we sometimes see motherly Guanyin figures. So once again, as Buddhism moves through Asia, it adapts with local cultures. It becomes different that way. And so what we might not ever see in India, which would be a female Avalokiteshvara, we do see in East Asia. Yeah.
I want to say too, that exhibition is up until July 12th, so if you have time to get up to Los Angeles, that would be a wonderful thing. I know at least one person here has seen it. It does span the full gamut. You've got a really good introduction now, and you'll be able to also travel through that as well. Thank you so much. That was a Our next talk is on June 2nd. It is the Reimagined Museum. We have Ali Gast from the Institute of Contemporary Art in San Francisco, sorry, I can say it, and which is a nomadic museum, non-collecting, and we have Matthew Thompson, who's the independent curator who did work at Powder Mountain and also at Aspen, and they will be here to share what they know about the different kinds of art spaces outside sometimes of buildings. Thank you again. Have a wonderful evening. It's